The most wanted criminal in the city walked into a diner and chose Dane Holloway as his entertainment for the evening. He mocked the old jacket, the unstable job, and the quiet life of a single father raising a daughter alone, then dared him to find his hiding place before midnight. Nobody in that room knew that the man in the worn jacket had once cracked cases that left an entire police department speechless. Dane simply looked at the mud on the stranger's boots, the oil staining his sleeve, and the brass key resting in his pocket. 3 small details were already enough to begin the hunt. If you enjoy stories built on sharp minds and sudden reversals, stay close, because this one rewards patience the same way Dane rewarded silence. If you like watching a quiet man outthink a city full of loud ones, tap subscribe now so you never miss where this hunt leads next. Inside the department, the people who worked alongside Dane Holloway called him by a quiet nickname that rarely left the building, the clockmaker, because he had a habit of taking apart cases the way a craftsman takes apart a watch, piece by piece, until every gear made sense and the whole mechanism finally moved forward on its own. He had earned that reputation over almost 2 decades of work that most of the city never heard about, since many of his most important cases had unfolded undercover, far away from press conferences and commendation ceremonies. Few of his colleagues realized that the soft-spoken detective eating breakfast every morning with his daughter had once dismantled smuggling rings twice the size of anything currently moving through Ravenport's harbor. That obscurity suited him fine, since recognition had never been the reason he did this work, and it left him free to observe people exactly as they were, without the performance most criminals reserved for cameras and headlines. Ravenport woke that morning the way it always did, with fog curling off the river and the rattle of an old freight line somewhere past the warehouses, indifferent to the fact that a reckoning was already in motion. Dane Holloway sat across from his 12-year-old daughter Piper in a corner booth of Hank Avery's diner, watching her drown a stack of pancakes in syrup while she talked, without pausing for breath, about a recital she had been rehearsing for weeks. He nodded in the right places, asked the right questions, and reminded her 3 separate times that he intended to be there. In the front row, no excuses. What Piper did not know, because Dane had never let her carry it, was that her father had spent the last several months sidelined from active duty inside the Major Crimes Division, suspended from field work after he raised concerns about a leak inside the department that nobody above him wanted to hear. He had no proof yet, only a pattern, and patterns were the one thing Dane Holloway had never been wrong about. When Piper finished eating, he walked her to the door, kissed the top of her head, and watched her climb into her aunt's car before he came back inside, ordered black coffee, and opened a worn notebook filled with his own private notes on a man named Gideon Cross. The notebook held 18 months of fragments, surveillance photographs nobody else cared to review, shipping manifests that did not add up, and a working theory that Cross was using the city's old rail network to move money no one could trace. Dane had built this case slowly, the way he built everything, refusing to let frustration push him toward guesses he could not defend. He was halfway through rereading a page about a warehouse fire that had conveniently destroyed certain records when a black sedan rolled to a stop outside the window. 2 men stepped out first, scanning the street with the practiced calm of men who got paid to notice nothing in particular. And then a 3rd man followed, unhurried, dressed like he had wandered out of a boardroom rather than the back of a getaway car. He walked into the diner like he owned the floor beneath it, and chose, of all the empty seats available to him, the booth directly beside Dane. Hank Avery, 63 years old and not easily impressed by anyone, greeted the newcomer with the same tired friendliness he gave every stranger, then nodded toward Dane and called him, half joking, the hardest working father in the neighborhood. The stranger's eyes flicked toward Dane with sudden, predatory interest, the way a man looks at prey he had not expected to stumble across so easily. This was Gideon Cross, though nobody in the diner recognized him because every public photograph of him was years out of date and carefully cultivated to look less dangerous than the man actually was. He studied the faded jacket, the dented sedan parked outside, and the general air of a man who had clearly been pushed to the margins of his own profession, and decided, in the space of about 4 seconds, that this stranger was someone he could enjoy humiliating before the night was over. For a moment, Gideon simply watched him over the rim of a coffee cup he had not ordered for himself, studying the worn cuffs of the jacket and the careful, unhurried way Dane folded his notebook, shut the instant a stranger sat too close. Most men in Ravenport who recognized danger walking through a door reacted with stiffness or fear, but Dane only adjusted his posture slightly and kept his expression unreadable, which Gideon mistook for nervousness rather than the opening move of a much longer game. Gideon leaned slightly toward him and asked, in a tone dripping with false sympathy, how a man survived on a salary that small while raising a child alone. Dane did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable, then sipped his coffee and said nothing at all, which seemed to irritate Gideon more than any retort could have. While Gideon kept talking, listing all the ways Dane's life looked smaller and sadder than his own, Dane was doing what he always did best, cataloging details nobody else in the room would have thought to notice. There was a streak of grayish mud caked into the heel of Gideon's boot, a faint blue-green smear of grease along the cuff of his sleeve, a dusting of pale chalk on one shoulder, and a small brass key visible at the edge of his coat pocket, stamped with the unmistakable shape of a railway wheel. 4 objects, 4 threads, and already the outline of a story was forming behind Dane's eyes. Gideon finally grew tired of failing to provoke a reaction and pulled a small carved chess piece from his coat, setting the knight down on the table between them with theatrical precision. He told Dane to pass along a message to whatever detectives the city still believed were capable of real work, that he had until midnight to be found, and that if he failed, something of enormous value would vanish from Ravenport forever. Dane looked at the knight for a long moment, turned it once between 2 fingers, and then looked back up at Gideon with an expression that held no fear at all. He told him, simply, that he had already been speaking to one of the city's better detectives this whole time, and that the conversation had already told him more than Gideon realized. Gideon mistook the calm for bravado, the way arrogant men often mistake patience for weakness, and decided to press further rather than retreat. He told Dane that a single father who could not control the chaos of his own household had no business pretending he could control anything as large as a criminal investigation. He slid a crisp $100 bill across the table and suggested, with a thin smile, that Dane use it to fix the dent in his car door, since apparently the police department could not be bothered to pay him enough to do it himself. The diner had gone quiet by then, every patron sensing something dangerous sitting 2 booths down, though none of them understood exactly what. Dane left the bill untouched and did not reach for handcuffs, did not raise his voice, and did not give Gideon the confrontation he so clearly wanted. Instead, Dane asked an odd, seemingly irrelevant question, wondering aloud when Gideon had last ridden a passenger train through the old Eastern Line. For one brief, unguarded moment, something shifted behind Gideon's eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly buried under practiced composure, but Dane had already seen it and knew exactly what it meant. Gideon recovered quickly and doubled down on his challenge, stating plainly that before midnight, the police would need to locate something extraordinarily valuable that he currently controlled, and that failure would mean it disappeared from the city for good, while he personally proved to every camera in Ravenport that the department was an expensive, useless institution. He stood, straightened his coat, and walked out with the unmistakable confidence of a man who believed he had just planted fear in a frightened, overmatched stranger. Dane watched the sedan pull away, made no move to chase it, and immediately began writing everything down while the details were still fresh. Hank asked why he hadn't tried to stop the man right there in the diner, and Dane explained, calmly, that arresting Gideon in a crowded room without backup would have endangered every witness inside and given his network exactly the chance it needed to destroy evidence elsewhere. He picked up his phone and called Captain Marin Cole, offering only one sentence by way of explanation, that Gideon Cross had just walked himself out of the shadows. On the other end of the line, Marin reminded him, not unkindly, that he still had no authority to investigate anything, not while Deputy Chief Alden Rusk's suspension remained in effect. Dane arrived at the precinct dressed in plain clothes, an outsider in a building he had served for nearly 2 decades, drawing the kind of glances reserved for men everyone assumed had already peaked and faded. Younger officers studied him the way people study a relic, polite enough but clearly unconvinced he still belonged among them. Rusk called an emergency briefing the moment diner surveillance confirmed. Gideon Cross had been caught on camera, brushing aside the obvious theatrics of the challenge as nothing more than a publicity stunt meant to embarrass the department. He ordered every available unit to converge on the riverside warehouses, the most visible and most obvious location in the entire city, the kind of choice that photographed well for reporters, but rarely produced real results. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and dry erase markers, and a wall-mounted screen displayed the diner footage on a loop, freezing every few seconds on Gideon's calm, unbothered face, as if daring the department to catch up with him. Officers who had spent the morning convinced this was nothing more than an elaborate prank now shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing for the first time that the man on the screen was real and dangerously patient. Rusk paced at the front of the room with the practiced authority of someone who had given 100 similar speeches, his voice carrying just enough confidence to mask how little he actually understood about what they were facing. Dane arrived in plain clothes rather than uniform, and chose a seat near the back, content to listen before speaking. The same instinct that had carried him through years of cases nobody else wanted to take seriously. When Dane was given the floor, he laid out his reasoning with the same unhurried precision he had used over coffee that morning. The mud on Gideon's boots, he explained, had not come from the riverbank at all, but from ash-rich soil found only near the northern rail corridor. The grease on his sleeve matched a compound used exclusively in old-style railway switching mechanisms, long since replaced everywhere except a handful of decommissioned junctions. The pale chalk dusting his shoulder was consistent with plaster found in maintenance tunnels rather than open warehouse floors, and the brass key in his pocket belonged unmistakably to a freight station system that had been shut down for decades. Rusk laughed outright, telling the room that Dane was building an entire criminal theory out of dirty shoes, and reminded everyone present that this was the same detective who had recently let his personal life unravel into instability. Dane did not argue the insult, but Marin pushed back hard enough that Rusk reluctantly agreed to send a unit toward the rail district, though he quietly redirected them to the eastern station rather than the locations Dane had actually described. Something about the speed of that decision bothered Dane immediately, a small, sharp wrongness he filed away rather than confronted in front of the room. Tessa Quinn, the department's quiet and meticulous data analyst, slipped him an old rail map later that afternoon without comment, and together they identified 3 sites consistent with every detail Gideon had unknowingly left behind: the Eastern Engine Yard, the Ashford Maintenance Shop, and a sealed freight sorting station called North Junction. The Eastern Yard was the obvious choice, practically begging to be discovered, and Dane suspected immediately that obvious was exactly the trap Gideon had built. Within minutes of the briefing ending, Gideon released a photograph to every local news outlet, showing himself standing confidently in front of the Eastern engine yard with the calm smile of a man who already knew exactly where the police were headed. Rusk sent the bulk of the department's resources there immediately, turning what should have been a careful investigation into a televised spectacle outside the gates. Dane warned that the location felt staged, but his objections were dismissed before the convoy had even left the lot. Inside the abandoned engine yard, officers found nothing but an empty room, a looping video feed, a second carved chess piece, and a countdown clock ticking steadily toward midnight, while reporters outside captured every second of the department's public failure. On the screen, Gideon appeared again, mocking the detective in the old jacket by name now, announcing to the entire city that Ravenport had just lost a precious hour it could never get back. Rusk turned his frustration on Dane immediately, blaming him for steering the search toward the rail district in the first place, conveniently ignoring that he himself had chosen the specific site that turned into a trap. Dane stayed composed and pointed out, evenly, that the decision to focus on the Eastern Yard rather than the other two candidates had been Rusk's alone. While replaying the recorded footage, Dane noticed a faint metallic chime repeating every 47 seconds in the background, a detail Tessa quickly traced to warning systems used on freight lift bridges across the city, though 4 separate bridges in Ravenport still used that exact mechanism. Returning to his memory of the diner encounter, Dane re-examined the placement of the chalk dust on Gideon's shoulder and realized it appeared only on one side of his coat, a pattern far more consistent with brushing against a narrow corridor than standing inside an open warehouse. That meant Gideon had recently passed through a maintenance tunnel rather than a wide industrial space, narrowing the possibilities considerably. Hank Avery, once a railway employee himself, remembered an old maintenance passage connecting North Junction to the freight lift bridge near Harrow, a tunnel that had vanished from modern maps after being sealed off more than 20 years earlier. Piecing it together, Dane concluded that whatever Gideon truly valued was not sitting in any engine yard at all, but actively moving somewhere beneath the city through that forgotten tunnel system. Marin quietly authorized Dane to continue assisting in an unofficial capacity, a decision Rusk learned about almost immediately and answered by demanding Dane surrender his badge altogether. Dane placed it on the desk without protest, an act of calm defiance that unsettled the room far more than any argument could have. He told Marin simply that the badge gave him the right to walk through certain doors, but everything Gideon had left behind told him which door to open first. Not long after he left the building, Tessa discovered that someone had just accessed Dane's confidential personnel file using credentials belonging to Deputy Chief Rusk himself. Tessa explained in hushed urgency that Rusk's account had recently opened several sensitive files in sequence, including the active case notes on Gideon Cross, a list of protected witnesses, an internal map of the department's evidence storage facility, and Dane's own personnel history. Each access seemed to occur shortly before Gideon adjusted his plans, a pattern far too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, though it still wasn't enough on its own to justify an arrest, since Rusk technically had legitimate clearance to view all of it. Dane asked her to keep the discovery quiet for the moment, preferring that whoever was leaking information continue believing they remained undetected. Marin revealed something she had never shared before, that 2 years earlier Dane had correctly predicted Gideon was using a seized evidence vehicle to smuggle cash through the city, only for the targeted warehouse to be emptied hours before the raid could happen. Dane sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the old, familiar ache of a suspicion finally confirmed rather than the satisfaction he might have expected. He had spent 2 years quietly doubting his own judgment, wondering whether the failed raid had simply been bad luck or carelessness on his part, and learning now that someone above him had deliberately sabotaged, it felt less like vindication and more like grief for the time he had lost second-guessing himself. Marin watched his face carefully, recognizing the particular kind of exhaustion that came from being right about something painful for far too long. She told him quietly that the department owed him an apology it would probably never formally offer, and Dane only nodded, unwilling to dwell on something he could not yet afford to feel. That earlier failure, manufactured rather than earned, had been the very thing Rusk used to push Dane out of fieldwork entirely, branding him reckless and unreliable in front of senior leadership. Understanding this now, Dane realized Gideon's appearance at the diner had never been an accident, since whatever profile he had been given clearly painted Dane as a suspended detective with nothing left to prove, a portrait built from selective records rather than the truth. The most significant successes of Dane's career had occurred during undercover operations that never appeared in standard files, which meant Gideon had walked into that diner believing he was choosing an easy, broken target. Dane decided to use that very misjudgment against him, asking Tessa to plant a single false report, claiming that the next raid would target the Harrow Lift Bridge at 10:30 that evening, a report visible to exactly one set of eyes inside the department. 15 minutes later, traffic cameras captured Gideon's convoy abruptly changing course, steering deliberately away from the Harrow Bridge, confirming once and for all that Rusk was the source of the leak. The convoy soon split into 3 separate directions, forcing Dane to determine which vehicle actually carried whatever Gideon was protecting. He noticed that only one of the 3 cars skipped the way station entirely, a detail suggesting it carried something far lighter than cash or stolen merchandise. Whatever Gideon valued enough to risk everything for likely wasn't bulk currency at all, but something small enough to fit easily out of sight, something carrying more power than its size suggested. Dane concluded that the true prize was probably a notebook or digital device containing complete evidence of the entire corruption network, the kind of object that could end careers with nothing more than a single download. Gideon, meanwhile, escalated his game far beyond anything Dane had expected, hijacking a digital billboard near City Hall to broadcast a message branding Dane Holloway as the living symbol of a powerless police department. The same diner footage from that morning played across screens throughout downtown Ravenport, turning a quiet breakfast into a public spectacle. Gideon announced that Dane had 3 hours left to find him, warning that failure would result in the release of doctored records designed to make it look as though Dane had taken bribes for years. His true objective was clear enough: to destroy Dane's reputation entirely before slipping out of the city for good. Rusk seized the opportunity to demand Dane's immediate arrest for internal investigation, an act so transparently aligned with Gideon's interests that it only deepened suspicion against him, while Marin delayed the paperwork just long enough to buy her detective more time. Dane refused to defend himself publicly, choosing instead to analyze every word in Gideon's broadcast with the same patience he applied to physical evidence. He noted the specific phrase Gideon used, describing himself as standing somewhere above the city, paired with a steady mechanical hum that sounded like taut steel cable in the background, and a train whistle that echoed twice rather than once, a sonic signature only possible in a tall, hollow structure near active rail lines. The most likely location matching that description was the old North Junction Control Tower, though Dane suspected almost immediately that Gideon was revealing far too much on purpose. The tower made an excellent stage for a broadcast, but it made a poor hiding place for anything Gideon actually cared about protecting, which meant the real prize was likely being moved somewhere else entirely while attention stayed locked on the tower above. Dane chose to accept the apparent invitation while quietly preparing a very different plan beneath it. He asked Tessa to plant another carefully falsified entry, this one suggesting that Dane remained unaware of any tunnel system beneath North Junction, reinforcing Rusk's false confidence that the detective was still chasing shadows. Hank produced a hand-drawn schematic of the old rail network, revealing a forgotten mail transfer room beneath the control tower, once used to pass sensitive documents discreetly between trains without ever exposing them on an open platform. That chamber connected through a narrow tunnel directly to the western freight dock, meaning Gideon could broadcast confidently from the tower above, while his notebook traveled quietly through the earth below, completely unseen by anyone watching the skyline. Dane told Marin with quiet certainty that Gideon wasn't actually daring them to find where he stood, but daring them to find what was moving beneath his feet the entire time. As Dane stepped toward the cameras one final time before heading toward North Junction, he deliberately allowed himself to appear uncertain, telling reporters that he had not yet pinpointed Gideon's location, a calculated admission meant to relax his opponent's guard. Gideon watched the broadcast from somewhere safe, convinced the pressure had finally cracked the detective everyone had told him to underestimate. Rusk made contact with Gideon directly afterward, confirming that police forces remained concentrated at both the Harrow Bridge and the North Junction Tower, an act Tessa secretly recorded through surveillance authorized under an emergency court order obtained earlier that day. Dane organized the final operation into 3 coordinated layers, with Marin leading a visible, public-facing team toward the control tower, state police quietly monitoring every road leaving the city, and a small, discreet unit preparing to enter the mail transfer room through the western tunnel. Because his suspension remained technically unresolved, Dane could not formally command an armed unit himself, so his role became locating the precise route and timing, rather than leading the raid directly. On his way toward North Junction, one final detail completed the picture in his mind. The carved knight Gideon had left behind at the diner that morning. Its base carried faint traces of copper dust and a curved scratch mark consistent with railway switching equipment, suggesting the piece had once rested atop an actual control panel rather than serving as a simple decoration. Dane realized Gideon had used the knight not merely as a taunt, but as a literal signal meant for someone operating within his network, since the knight's movement in chess always shifts direction twice before returning toward its starting point. That pattern matched the convoy's earlier detour perfectly, suggesting the true prize had never traveled far from the diner where this entire confrontation began. It was likely now resting somewhere inside the old storage yard behind the very street where Gideon had first chosen to mock him. Dane understood at last why Gideon selected that particular diner for their first encounter, since beneath its floor lay an old transfer passage connecting directly back to North Junction, a detail almost lost to time. Hank recalled a steel door sealed shut years earlier, and upon inspection, Dane noticed the surrounding brickwork looked noticeably newer than the rest of the wall, confirming a hidden entrance had been recently reopened. The air beneath the diner smelled of rust and standing water, and the narrow passage forced him to walk with one shoulder brushing the cold brick wall, his flashlight beam catching decades of undisturbed dust along the floor except for a single, narrow trail of recent footprints leading deeper into the dark. Every few yards he paused to listen, picking out the faint hum of machinery somewhere ahead, the same steady vibration he remembered from Gideon's broadcast earlier that evening. He thought briefly of Piper, of the recital still waiting for him at the end of all this, and let that thought settle into the same steady calm that had carried him through every dangerous hallway he had ever walked. As Dane stepped into the tunnel beneath the diner, his phone buzzed with a direct message from Gideon himself. reading simply that the single father had finally found the right door. Dane understood immediately that Gideon had anticipated this possibility from the start, though Gideon, in turn, had no idea that Rusk's betrayal had already been confirmed and was now working against him rather than for him. Dane pressed forward while maintaining quiet contact with Marin the entire way, descending into a narrow mail transfer room where Gideon waited alongside a single assistant and a metal case resting on a folding table. There was no dramatic shootout waiting for him, since Gideon believed Dane had come alone and ordered his men to stand well back, preferring to win this final moment through words and a recorded confession of defeat rather than violence. The mail transfer room was smaller than Dane expected, lined with rusted shelving that once held parcels destined for trains long since scrapped, lit only by a single hanging bulb that swayed faintly with the vibration of machinery somewhere overhead. Gideon stood near the metal case, with the relaxed posture of a man performing for an audience he believed was already defeated, while his assistant lingered nervously near the far wall, clearly uncomfortable with how quiet everything had become. Gideon resumed his mockery almost immediately, reminding Dane that he no longer carried a badge, that the department had turned its back on him completely, and that a single father had no business risking everything when a daughter back home depended entirely on his survival. Dane conceded that one point honestly, admitting he had no intention of acting recklessly tonight. Gideon opened the metal case to reveal a small storage device containing a complete list of bribed officials, detailed records of laundered funds, and the falsified files meant to destroy Dane's career, then offered him a simple trade: take the money, leave the city, and protect the quiet life he clearly valued so much. Dane refused without hesitation, and when Gideon asked why a man so thoroughly dismissed by his own department would still choose to protect it, Dane answered that he wasn't protecting a building or the people running it, but the ordinary citizens who would suffer the moment that truth was sold to the highest bidder. Gideon signaled for his assistant to seal the tunnel doors behind them, but nothing happened, since Tessa had already disabled the rail control system from a remote terminal earlier that night. When Gideon demanded his assistant call Rusk for help, the line was instead routed straight into a state police surveillance room, where officers confirmed Rusk had already been detained, attempting to flee the precinct with a bag full of incriminating files. Gideon tried to maintain his composure, insisting there was no proof connecting him personally to the case in his hands, until Dane gestured toward the small camera embedded discreetly inside the carved knight Gideon had given him that very morning. Tessa had discovered the chess piece was quietly transmitting location data back to the storage device the entire time, meaning the very tool Gideon used to track his target had instead confirmed his own location and proven his direct ownership of the evidence inside that case. Gideon spat that Dane was nothing more than a cop without a badge, and Dane answered calmly that the badge had only ever confirmed who he was, never determined what he was capable of seeing. Moments later, every light in the mail transfer room switched on at once, revealing state police officers positioned at each exit, having entered silently while Gideon remained fixated on his own performance. Realizing every possible escape route had already been quietly closed off without a single shot fired, Gideon attempted one last desperate move, trying to wipe the device clean before it could be examined, only to learn Tessa had already copied its contents through the very chess piece he had handed Dane himself hours earlier. He threatened to release the falsified files anyway, but Dane informed him calmly that forensic analysts had already confirmed the documents were manipulated, stripping away his final piece of leverage entirely. Gideon shifted tactics once more, offering to name every corrupt official in exchange for leniency, only for Marin to step forward and reveal that those very names already existed within the data Tessa had recovered, rendering his last bargaining chip worthless. For the first time that night, Gideon's composure finally cracked, and he asked Dane, almost involuntarily, exactly when he had first pieced together the truth. Dane walked him through it patiently. The ash-colored mud that identified North Junction, the distinct blue-green grease tied to old switching equipment, the chalk dust revealing a narrow tunnel rather than an open warehouse, the brass key confirming an abandoned freight system, the night's movement pattern exposing the convoy's true route, and Rusk's suspiciously immediate reaction confirming the leak long before anyone else suspected it. Gideon finally understood that the very moment he had chosen to mock a tired, overlooked detective in a diner was the exact moment he had unknowingly handed that detective the entire case. Dane did not place the handcuffs on Gideon himself, choosing instead to let Marin make the formal arrest since his own suspension technically remained unresolved at that point. Gideon was led back through the very diner where the confrontation had begun that morning, past tables and chairs that had witnessed his first attempt at humiliation, and Hank stood quietly behind the counter, offering no satisfaction or mockery in return. That silence carried more weight than any celebration could have, making Gideon's defeat feel heavier with every step toward the door. Before he was finally escorted away, Gideon asked Dane why he wasn't bothering to gloat over such a clear victory, and Dane answered simply that the best people in this line of work never needed to turn their job into a performance for anyone watching. Later that evening, Marin received confirmation that every charge against Dane had been formally dismissed, though even then he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to return to the department in the same capacity as before. The hearing room was packed that week, filled with reporters, city officials, and officers who had spent years walking past Dane's desk without ever truly seeing him. And for the first time, every one of them sat quietly while he spoke. He kept his statement brief, refusing the temptation to recount every insult or dismissal he had endured, since dwelling on those moments would have served his own pride far more than it would have served the city. What mattered now, he told the room, was making sure the next detective who noticed something wrong would not have to fight an entire department just to be heard. In the days that followed, Gideon's arrest triggered a sweeping internal investigation that reached far beyond a single corrupt official. The recovered files confirmed that Rusk had been selling advanced details of planned raids for years, that evidence had been quietly siphoned out of department storage, that funds meant for the city's reconstruction project had been systematically drained, and that several small business owners had been wrongly blamed for losses caused entirely by his network. Rusk was stripped of his position and formally charged, while officers who had once laughed openly at Dane's theories were forced to sit through replayed footage of him correctly predicting North Junction long before anyone else took it seriously. During the formal hearing that followed, city leadership publicly credited Dane as the sharpest detective Ravenport currently had on its payroll, though he refused to use the moment to embarrass anyone who had doubted him along the way. Instead, Dane requested 3 specific reforms before agreeing to anything further, insisting that access to sensitive case files require independent oversight going forward, that officers who raised warnings receive real protection rather than quiet punishment, and that Tessa's analytical team gain the authority to report directly outside the normal chain of command whenever signs of corruption appeared. City leadership offered him the position of acting deputy chief, a clear path toward influence and prestige, but Dane turned it down without much hesitation, explaining plainly that he had no interest in spending his career trapped behind a desk far from real cases. He agreed instead to return as head of the Major Crimes Unit, requesting only a schedule stable enough to remain present for his daughter, a request Marin approved immediately, assuring him that being a devoted father had never once made him a weaker detective. If anything, that responsibility had taught him precisely why every decision had to bring himself and his team home safely, every single time. That same evening, sorting through old paperwork from the case, Dane found the crumpled $100 bill Gideon had left on the table that very first morning, a bill he had never once touched. Several weeks later, he returned to that same diner with Piper beside him, the restaurant now somewhat famous around the neighborhood, though Hank had stubbornly kept the same booth exactly where the confrontation first began. Piper asked, with the blunt curiosity only a child can manage, why everyone around the city suddenly called her father the sharpest detective in Ravenport. Dane smiled and told her people were simply exaggerating about a man who had only ever learned to pay close attention to small things. He slid the old $100 bill across the counter toward Hank, who immediately refused it, insisting he wanted nothing to do with money tied to a man like Gideon Cross. Dane suggested instead that the money go toward repairing the diner's old, faded sign outside, turning what had once been an attempt at humiliation into something genuinely useful for the neighborhood. Piper reminded her father, with the particular seriousness reserved for important childhood events, that he had promised to attend her recital, and Dane assured her he had already cleared the entire evening, having requested the day off long before this conversation even began. That small, ordinary promise mattered more than any headline from the past several weeks, proving that he had never truly needed to choose between being a devoted father and being an exceptional detective, since both had always been the same steady, patient man underneath. As they settled into their booth, Marin walked in unexpectedly and placed a new case file gently on the table in front of him, an unrelated investigation containing 3 small details the rest of the team had apparently overlooked entirely. Dane glanced briefly at the photographs inside, immediately noticing something everyone else had clearly missed, then quietly closed the folder and set it aside. Piper laughed at something on her phone, oblivious to the quiet weight settling over her father across the table, and Dane found himself grateful, not for the first time, that she would never have to carry the parts of his job that kept him awake some nights. He thought about the chess piece still sitting in an evidence locker downtown, a small carved object that had once been used to track him, and instead became the very thing that exposed everything Gideon had tried to hide. There was a kind of quiet justice in that, the same justice that ran through nearly everything Dane had ever solved, where the tools built to intimidate ordinary people so often became the instruments of their own undoing. He told Marin, without any urgency in his voice, that the case would still be waiting for him tomorrow morning. Outside the window, Ravenport continued its restless, indifferent motion, traffic moving, lights flickering on along the waterfront, the city utterly unaware of how close it had come to losing something it never even knew was at risk. Inside that quiet booth, Dane sat across from his daughter, unbothered by the weight of the day behind him, fully present in the simple, unremarkable comfort of an ordinary dinner together. Gideon Cross had once assumed that a tired jacket and a modest car were proof of a broken, easily dismissed man, never imagining the patience hidden behind that calm exterior. He had mistaken silence for surrender, mistaken stillness for weakness, and in doing so handed every clue he carried straight into the hands of the one detective in Ravenport, sharp enough to notice them all. What Gideon never understood, until it was far too late to matter, was that the most dangerous people in any room are rarely the ones demanding everyone's attention. They are the quiet ones sitting patiently in the corner, watching everything, remembering everything, waiting for the precise moment when every overlooked detail finally clicks into place. Dane Holloway had spent his entire career being underestimated by people who mistook humility for weakness. And that single, persistent mistake had cost Gideon Cross everything he believed he controlled. In the end, The city's most wanted criminal had not been outsmarted by force, wealth, or power, but by an ordinary man in an old jacket who simply refused to stop paying attention.